It was a night like any other, or so I thought as I sat in my cozy living room. The rain had started softly at first, but quickly escalated to a heavy downpour. The sound of it hitting the windows was nearly deafening. I was tucked under a thick blanket, sipping on some tea, watching a horror movie that didn't seem nearly as frightening as the storm outside. The wind was howling, rattling the branches of the trees like skeletal hands reaching toward my house. Every now and then, lightning cracked the sky, illuminating the night for a split second, casting eerie shadows across the walls. I felt the usual isolation of being home alone, but there was something different about this night. The storm felt almost too unnatural. The wind seemed to whisper just outside the window, and the temperature in the room dropped significantly, though the heating was on. The eerie feeling made me glance at the clock. 11:45 p.m. It was getting late, and I wasn't expecting anyone. I had just made the decision to head to bed when I heard it. A soft, tentative knock. At first I thought it was just the wind, the house creaking. But then it came again. Louder this time. I froze, heart pounding in my chest. Who would be out there in a storm like this? I walked cautiously to the door, my bare feet tapping against the cold wooden floor. I peered through the peephole, but all I could see was darkness. There was no car in the driveway, no one on the porch, only the rain pelting down relentlessly. But the knock came again, louder this time, almost demanding. I stood there, paralyzed with indecision. Should I open the door? Was it a trick? The storm had intensified, the thunder rolling so violently that the house seemed to shake with each strike. Despite my hesitation, I found myself unbolting the door, opening it just enough to peer outside. I could barely make out a figure in the rain, drenched from head to toe, his face obscured by the shadows and the water dripping from his hair. The man's posture was slumped, as though exhausted or perhaps injured. He stepped forward slightly, his hand raised in an almost pleading gesture, though he said nothing at first. The cold air rushed in as the door creaked open. "Excuse me, I need help," he said, his voice strained. I wasn't sure if it was the wind or if his words were laced with fear, but they felt unnatural. My car broke down just down the road. It's too dangerous to be out there in the storm. I was hoping I could stay the night? His eyes met mine through the crack in the door. There was something in his gaze. Wild. Desperate. A shiver ran down my spine. I didn't want to let a stranger into my home, especially not during a storm, but something compelled me to respond. He looked pitiful, stranded in the storm. His clothes were torn and his hands shook uncontrollably, clutching at the doorframe. I don't know if I should," I stammered instinctively, glancing over my shoulder at the warmth of the house. "I'm sorry, but it's not really safe to let someone I don't know in." But before I could shut the door, he said, "Please, I have nowhere else to go. My phone's dead, and I don't know what to do. I'll just stay until the storm passes, I swear." The pleading in his voice was enough to weaken my resolve. I didn't want to turn him away, especially not in the middle of this dreadful storm. I glanced over at the clock once more, only a few minutes until midnight. The sense of dread grew. Still, I opened the door wider. "Okay, just for a little while, all right?" The knock was soft at first, almost like a distant echo carried on the howling wind. I hesitated, unsure if I had heard it correctly. The storm outside seemed to amplify every noise, so it could have been the house creaking, or perhaps a branch tapping against the window. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was nothing. But then it came again. This time louder, more persistent, the sound vibrating through the walls and into my bones. It wasn't just a random knock, it felt deliberate, urgent. I stood frozen, staring at the door, trying to figure out what to do. It was nearly midnight, and I was alone. My thoughts raced. Who could it be? Was it someone lost in the storm, or worse, someone who had intentionally sought me out? I was no expert on these things, but I had heard enough stories to know that strange encounters on nights like these often weren't what they seemed. Despite my gut telling me to leave the door shut, my feet moved before my mind could catch up. Slowly, cautiously, I walked across the room and toward the door, each step making the air feel heavier, as though the house itself were holding its breath. The knock came once more, this time so loud it sent a jolt of panic through me. Whoever was out there was not going to go away until I answered. I reached for the door handle, but my hand hesitated. I pressed my ear against the door, listening closely, trying to hear anything. Voices, breathing, footsteps. But all I could hear was the relentless storm. There was nothing. No car in the driveway, no shadows lurking in the yard, just the heavy rain and the wind. Still, that knock echoed in my ears, demanding attention. I quickly checked the peephole, but all I saw was darkness, as if the storm itself swallowed the world outside. I couldn't make out any features, just the blur of the night. Maybe it was the wind playing tricks on me, I thought, but something deep in my stomach twisted. I couldn't ignore it. Whoever it was, they needed help. I couldn't leave them out there alone. I took a deep breath and opened the door just enough to peek outside. At first, I saw nothing. The rain was coming down so heavily that I could barely make out the outline of the porch, let alone the figure who had been knocking. But then through the haze of rain, I noticed a silhouette, a man standing on my doorstep, soaked to the bone, his features hidden by the darkness and the storm. "Are you all right?" I called out, trying to make myself heard over the wind. The man didn't answer right away. He only stepped closer, his eyes wide, like a man desperate to escape something unseen. His hair was plastered to his forehead, and water dripped from his clothes, pooling on the porch beneath his feet. When he finally spoke, his voice was hoarse, as though he hadn't spoken in hours or perhaps days. "My car broke down," he said, his words stumbling out in a rushed, breathless manner. "I've been trying to get help. Please, I just need to stay somewhere until the storm passes. Can you help me?" I glanced back inside, torn between what was safe and what was right. I wasn't one to ignore someone in need, but I'd heard enough stories of people who used situations like this to take advantage of others. His frantic eyes begged for something more than just shelter. They seemed to be pleading for safety. There was something in his gaze that made my skin crawl. "I'll just stay in the living room," he added quickly, "just until the storm stops." I hesitated. Should I let him in? I had no reason to trust him, but the storm raged outside, and something told me I wouldn't be able to sleep peacefully knowing someone was out there, exposed to the elements. With a sigh, I opened the door wider, standing aside to let him in. The moment the door swung open wider, the man stepped forward. He didn't even bother to remove his wet shoes before entering, leaving small puddles of water trailing behind him as he crossed the threshold. I instinctively backed away, but the stranger didn't seem to notice. His eyes never left me as he entered the living room, dripping water onto the wooden floor. There was an odd stillness to his movements. It was as though he wasn't truly present, as if his body was merely an extension of something else, something darker. "Thank you," he said quietly, his voice still hoarse, though there was a hint of relief in his tone now that he was inside. He looked around, his gaze scanning the room, taking in every detail. It was unsettling to see how quickly he adapted to his surroundings, as if he were no longer an outsider, but rather someone who belonged here. His eyes lingered a little too, long on the furniture, the windows, the door to the hallway. I found myself instinctively locking the deadbolt behind him. "I didn't mean to disturb you," he added, though his tone didn't sound apologetic. Instead, it was as if he were trying to make himself comfortable in a space that wasn't his. "I just didn't know where else to go. The rain, it's dangerous out there." His words seemed normal enough, but there was something about the way he spoke that raised alarm bells in my head. Why had he been walking alone, stranded in a storm with no sign of a car nearby? If his car had truly broken down, wouldn't there be evidence of it? Where were the flashing hazard lights, the broken down vehicle? None of that made sense, but I couldn't bring myself to question him directly. I gestured to the couch. "You can sit down and dry off," I said, trying to sound calm, though my nerves were beginning to get the best of me. The stranger didn't sit immediately, instead hovering near the center of the room, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. "Do you need a towel?" I asked, my voice trembling slightly. He nodded, and I moved quickly to fetch one, trying to ignore the feeling that had settled in my stomach. There was something off about him, something that felt wrong, though I couldn't put my finger on it. His movements were too deliberate, too controlled, as if he were aware of how his presence affected me. When I handed him the towel, he took it without a word, then began to dry his hair, his gaze fixed on the floor. I noticed that his hands were trembling slightly, but not from the cold. It was more like he was suppressing something deeper, darker. As I watched him, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was hiding something. But what? I walked back to the kitchen, my mind racing with questions. Who was this man? Why had he come to my door at this hour? And why did I feel so uneasy around him? It had only been a few minutes since I had let him in, yet it already felt like hours. I could hear the sound of him moving around in the living room, his footsteps soft, almost too quiet. The air in the house seemed to grow heavier with each passing moment. I tried to tell myself that I was being irrational. He was just a man stranded in a storm, nothing more. But something told me that this wasn't just a chance encounter. There was something about him, about this night, that felt orchestrated, as if it had been set in motion long before I had even opened the door. I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that I had made a terrible mistake. Suddenly, I heard a noise behind me, a soft sound, like a footstep on the hardwood floor. I spun around, my heart leaping into my throat. But when I turned, I found the stranger standing in the doorway, staring at me with a look I couldn't quite decipher. It wasn't the expression of a man who was grateful for my help. No, this was something else entirely. "Thank you for letting me in," he said again, his voice even quieter than before. "I know it's late, and I'm sorry for imposing, but I really appreciate it." I nodded, forcing a smile, though my throat felt tight. "Of course," I replied, my voice barely audible. "You can stay here for as long as you need to." As the minutes ticked by, I found myself watching him, more than I probably should have. He had dried himself off with the towel, but he didn't sit on the couch right away. Instead, he paced the room, looking out the window as the storm continued to rage outside. The way he moved was unsettling. Each step was deliberate, slow, as though he was thinking too much about where to place his feet. He wasn't making any small talk, nor did he seem in any rush to explain himself further. He had mentioned his car breaking down, but beyond that, there were no more details. No mention of what kind of car it was or why he hadn't called for help or even mentioned where he was from. I kept thinking of how he had looked when he first appeared on my doorstep, eyes wild and wide with fear. But now the man seemed to have settled into a quiet calmness that felt too perfect, too practiced. His eyes occasionally flicked over to me, but it wasn't the gaze of a stranger seeking comfort. It was as if he was assessing me, reading me in some way. My stomach churned at the thought. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of silence, he spoke again, but his words were odd, almost cryptic. "You live alone here?" he asked, his voice just a little too smooth, too measured. I froze for a second, unsure of why he was asking. I nodded, trying to keep my voice steady as I replied, "Yes, I do." He looked around the room, his gaze lingering for too long on the door to the hallway and the staircase that led upstairs. He didn't speak again, but something in his eyes made me feel like he was observing every single detail of my home, mentally cataloging it all. I had never felt this exposed in my own space before. I tried to shake off the feeling. Maybe I was overthinking things. Maybe I was just being paranoid. After all, it was a stormy night, and people do strange things when they're caught in bad weather. But I couldn't ignore the unsettling thought that he wasn't just looking for shelter. There was a deeper need lurking beneath the surface, a hunger that made me nervous. As he paced around the room, he moved like a predator inspecting its territory. His steps were slow and deliberate, and his movements fluid, as though he was trying to make himself invisible, blending into the surroundings. He didn't seem cold or uncomfortable, even though his clothes had been soaked through. Instead, He seemed completely at ease. That was what unnerved me the most. His complete and utter calmness in a situation that should have been uncomfortable for anyone. The quiet tension in the room was suffocating. Every time I glanced at him, he was watching me with an intensity that felt almost like a silent judgment. I couldn't put my finger on it, but something about the way he stood there looking at me made me feel small, like I was the one being observed, the one under scrutiny. "Can I use your phone?" he asked abruptly, his voice cutting through the silence. I hadn't offered him the phone before, and I hesitated. My gut told me not to let him have it, but I couldn't justify the refusal. "Of course," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. I stood up, walking to the kitchen, to grab the phone, but all I could think about was how strange everything felt. This was a simple act of kindness, but it felt wrong. I handed him the phone, and he took it without a word, his fingers trembling slightly as he dialed a number with surprising speed. I watched from the corner of my eye, trying to appear casual, though every instinct in me was screaming that something wasn't right. There was an odd stillness to the room again, a quietness that was only broken by the sound of the rain hammering against the windows. He stood near the window as he dialed, his back to me. I couldn't see the number he was calling, but I could hear the faint murmur of a voice on the other end. The conversation was brief, so brief that I thought I might have imagined it. He spoke softly, too softly for me to hear the words clearly, and then, without explanation, he ended the call. He hung up the phone with a flick of his wrist and then turned to face me. "The line's down," he said quietly, as if that explained everything. He seemed calm again, but there was an eerie finality to his words. "It happens sometimes, in storms like this." His gaze flicked over to the window, where the storm showed no signs of letting up. His tone was neutral, almost too neutral. But then he glanced back at me and his eyes widened slightly, as if he had just realized something. I think I'll just wait here. The storm won't let up anytime soon, and I'm not sure I want to go out there." His words, which should have sounded like the simple statement of a man looking for shelter, instead felt like something else, something carefully planned. It was as though he was testing me, trying to see how I would react. He wasn't asking. To leave wasn't even asking for anything. He simply stated that he would wait. It was as if he had already made up his mind about the situation. I felt the knot in my stomach tighten again, that uncomfortable feeling gnawing at my gut. I had already let him inside. I couldn't exactly throw him out in the middle of the storm. But I couldn't help but wonder, what was his true purpose here? And why hadn't he called anyone else for help? I had to admit it. I wasn't just worried about the storm. I was worried about him. The feeling of unease settled deeper into my bones as I tried to ignore the strange tension in the room. I busied myself with simple tasks, making a cup of tea, adjusting the blinds to block the rain. But all the while, my mind kept drifting back to the man sitting in my living room. His presence felt like a shadow over me, even though he was seated at the far side of the room. I couldn't explain it, but the atmosphere had shifted. It wasn't the storm that unnerved me anymore. It was him. The way he never seemed to fully relax, the way his eyes followed my every movement. Every time I glanced up, I caught him watching me, but he would quickly look away, as if he didn't want me to catch him staring. He would look down at his hands, fiddle with a button on his coat, or stare out the window. But I could feel the weight of his gaze, always there even when I wasn't looking. I kept telling myself that I was being paranoid, that I had let a stranger into my house and was now overthinking every little detail. But every instinct in me told me I had made a mistake. There was something off about him, something I couldn't quite put into words. It wasn't the fact that he was a stranger in my home. It wasn't just the weirdness of the situation. It was something deeper, a primal sense that told me that I was not alone in that room, that there was something more to him than met the eye. I thought I heard a noise from the hallway, a faint sound like a footstep, but when I turned, there was nothing there. I felt my heart skip a beat. My skin prickled, and I turned back to the stranger, hoping to find some sign of an explanation, but his gaze was fixed on the storm outside. "Are you okay?" I asked, trying to break the silence. "I'm fine," he replied, though the tightness in his voice suggested otherwise. His hand twitched slightly as he rubbed his neck. The tension in the room thickened, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. Something wasn't right, and it wasn't just the storm outside anymore. The silence between us became unbearable. I continued to try to busy myself, cleaning up, making more tea, trying to create some normalcy out of the awkwardness. But no matter what I did, the man remained seated across the room watching me with those unnerving eyes. His silence had become almost suffocating. It wasn't like he was shy or unsure. No, his silence was deliberate. He wasn't talking because he didn't want to. I tried to initiate a conversation, asking where he was from, how far he had traveled, anything to break the tension. But he only responded with short, non-committal answers that didn't encourage any further discussion. Each time I tried, it was as if the words evaporated into the air, leaving behind only the uncomfortable hum of the storm. His gaze followed me around the room, and even though he didn't speak, I could feel the weight of his attention like a physical presence. It was unsettling. I couldn't help but wonder if he was sizing me up, figuring out what he would do next. I wanted to ask him to leave, but something held me back. Perhaps it was my innate sense of politeness, or perhaps it was the storm that made me feel like I had no other option. But the longer he sat there in silence, the more I felt the room closing in on me. I didn't want to admit it, but I felt trapped. Trapped not just by the weather, but by this stranger. His presence felt like a dark cloud hanging over me, and every time I glanced at him, I was reminded that I had let him in. I couldn't shake the feeling that the man wasn't who he claimed to be. I couldn't help but notice how often he looked at me. His eyes were intense, piercing, as though he were examining every part of me. It wasn't the kind of gaze that came from a friendly guest. It was more like the kind of gaze you'd get from someone who was studying you, trying to figure you out, as though you were an enigma. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, but soon I couldn't ignore it. Every time I caught his eye, I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. There were times when he didn't blink, his stare unwavering, as though he was looking directly into my soul. I tried to avert my gaze, but his eyes followed me. I noticed how he'd watch me more intently whenever I moved around the room, as though he could predict my every motion. It wasn't natural. It wasn't the kind of eye contact someone would make after a polite conversation. It was something darker, more possessive. It was as if he was watching me for a reason. His gaze felt like a heavy weight, and the longer he looked at me, the more I started to question his motives. I tried to distract myself by focusing on the storm outside the window, but I could still feel his gaze burning into me, like a presence that never truly left. At one point, the silence became so thick that it almost felt like the room was closing in. I had been avoiding looking at him directly, but I couldn't help it any longer. I turned to face him, hoping to break the tension with something, anything. But when I looked at him, he was staring right back at me, his lips parted like he was about to say something. And then he spoke. But it wasn't what I expected. Do you ever wonder if people are hiding something? His voice was low and calm, almost too calm, like he wasn't really asking a question but making a statement. His words hung in the air, and for a moment I couldn't respond. I didn't know how to respond. I felt a chill spread through me and my throat tightened. What was he trying to say? What did he mean by that question? The question felt like a riddle, a probing inquiry into something I didn't understand. My mind raced, but no clear answers came to me. Was he asking about his own secrets? Or was he asking about mine? I didn't know, but the discomfort in my chest grew heavier. I had let him into my home, and now I had no idea how to handle this. I glanced at the clock. It was well past midnight now, and the storm outside had not shown any signs of relenting. The wind howled like a chorus of ghosts, and the rain pummeled against the windows as if trying to break through. The house seemed to grow colder by the minute. The man hadn't moved much, but I could sense the subtle shift in the air. He seemed to be waiting for something, and I felt like I was too. Waiting for the storm to end. Waiting for this strange encounter to come to a conclusion. But the more I waited, the more uneasy I became. I glanced at the front door, considering whether it was too late to ask him to leave. But something stopped me. The storm outside seemed to be intensifying, and I couldn't bring myself to throw him out into the chaos of the night. I didn't want to be the one to send him back into the darkness, even though a part of me was terrified of what might happen if he stayed. As the minutes passed, I couldn't help but feel that midnight wasn't just an arbitrary time. It felt like a marker, a turning point in the story. The moment when things shifted, when the strange unease I'd been feeling became something more real. Then, without warning, the man's demeanor shifted. His previously calm, quiet composure snapped, and something else took its place. His posture became rigid and his eyes grew wide again, though this time it was different. It wasn't fear, not anymore. It was something darker, something predatory. He stood up suddenly, his movements sharp and deliberate. I watched in frozen silence as he crossed the room toward me. My heart raced, and I backed away instinctively, fear crawling through me. What was he doing? He didn't say anything. His footsteps were silent on the wooden floor, and the air seemed to thicken with tension. It was like something had changed in him, like he was no longer the lost traveler I had let in, but something far more dangerous. The storm outside howled louder, but inside, the silence felt suffocating. When he reached me, he stopped, standing too close for comfort. His breath was shallow, his lips slightly parted as if he were tasting the air. I took a step back, but he didn't move away. Instead, he whispered, "Can I ask you a question?" I nodded, my throat tight, unsure what to expect. "Would you let me stay forever?" The question wasn't one I had anticipated. It felt like a punch to the stomach, and my mind scrambled to make sense of it. My body stiffened, and I could feel my pulse racing in my ears. I could barely comprehend what he was asking. Was he joking? No, the intensity in his voice made it clear that he wasn't. This was no ordinary request. I opened my mouth to say something, but no words came. Instead, I took another step back, my back hitting the wall. The words hung in the air between us, suffocating the space. My body went cold, and I instinctively backed away again. His gaze never left me. The storm outside seemed to crescendo, its howling wind and rain now drowning out every other sound. But inside it was dead silent, except for the frantic beating of my heart. He didn't move closer, but the tension in the room was unbearable. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. His question echoed in my mind over and over again like a mantra. Would I let him stay forever? No, I managed to whisper, barely able to form the word. But the moment I spoke, the air seemed to shift. The man's smile was small, but it wasn't reassuring. It was a smile full of something darker, something that made my skin crawl.